Hi, folks. I'm Danielle, and welcome to Sybil's Lab of Cartomantics. This is the Tarot Seriously series, and if that title sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, that's intentional. We're here to take tarot seriously, but not literally. We're here for tarot readers who think carefully about what they're doing, and for skeptics who are willing to linger a little longer with symbolic systems than they usually might. If you've ever felt a quiet discomfort around tarot, not because it lacks meaning, but because it's so often misunderstood, this series is for you. Here's what we're doing in these episodes. We're treating tarot as an interpretive practice rather than a belief system. I'm drawing on literary study and critical thinking to explore how the cards actually generate insight without requiring faith, prediction, or any supernatural commitment. Think of it as close reading for your life. We're asking a simple but powerful question. What happens when we take tarot seriously without taking it literally? Today's episode is called Tarot as a Tool for Thinking, What Replaces Belief. And we're going to dig into exactly that. Not what you should believe about tarot, but what cognitive skills it actually trains you to develop. Because once you stop worrying about belief, something far more interesting becomes visible. Let's get into it. Here's something I've noticed. When you tell someone you read tarot, they immediately want to know if you believe in it, as if belief were the only possible relationship you could have with a deck of cards covered in medieval imagery. As if the question, do you believe, actually compares what's happening when you lay out the Tower, the Eight of Cups, and the Queen of Swords, and suddenly understand something about your situation that was invisible to you 5 minutes ago. So let me answer that question differently. Or rather, let me reframe it entirely. The relationship I have with tarot isn't primarily about belief. It's about practice. It's about what the cards do as a thinking tool, regardless of whether there's anything mystical happening behind the scenes. I'm not here to argue against spiritual approaches to tarot. Plenty of thoughtful practitioners work with the cards in ways that include intuition, synchronicity, or other frameworks I'm not exploring here. That's not my focus, and it's not what this series is about. What I am interested in, what I find endlessly fascinating, is this. Tarot is one of the most sophisticated tools for thinking that I've ever encountered. And whether or not something else is also happening when you shuffle the deck, the cognitive work the cards facilitate is real, observable, and worth examining on its own terms. That's the lens I'm using here. Not because it's the only valid lens, but because it's the one that lets us talk about what tarot does without requiring agreement about what tarot is. This essay is about what replaces belief. It's about the specific mental operations that tarot trains you to perform, operations that are useful whether you're trying to understand a relationship, make a career decision, or just figure out why you've been feeling weird all week. Because here's the thing. Tarot works, not because it's magic, but because it's a structured practice for doing things your brain is already capable of, but rarely does systematically. It's a technology for thinking, and like any technology, you don't have to believe in it. You just have to understand how to use it. Let's start with the most fundamental thing tarot does. It forces pattern recognition across different domains simultaneously. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. That's not metaphorical. It's literally what your neural networks evolved to do. You're constantly scanning your environment for patterns, making predictions based on those patterns, updating your models when the predictions fail. This is happening all the time, mostly unconsciously. You recognize your friend's face in a crowd. You know the milk has gone bad before you taste it. You sense that your boss is in a bad mood from the way she said good morning. Pattern recognition. But here's the problem. Your pattern recognition systems are also deeply biased toward confirming what you already think. You notice the evidence that supports your existing narrative and filter out the evidence that contradicts it. You see what you expect to see. This isn't a moral failing. It's just how prediction-based processing works. Your brain is trying to be efficient, and efficiency means not reconsidering everything from scratch every single time. Tarot disrupts this. When you draw cards for a question, you're introducing a random element that your brain then has to make sense of. And here's where it gets interesting. You can't just see what you expect to see because you didn't choose the cards. They're arbitrary. The Three of Swords shows up whether you wanted it to or not. So your brain has to work harder. It has to find patterns that actually fit the cards in front of you, not just the patterns you were already committed to seeing. Let me give you a concrete example. A few months ago, someone came to me for a reading about whether to leave their job. Standard question, right? They were unhappy, feeling undervalued, considering quitting without another position lined up. They wanted clarity. What they expected, I think, was either validation that they should quit or reassurance that they should stay. A clear answer. The cards were the Four of Pentacles, the Eight of Wands, and the Star. Now, the Four of Pentacles is typically about holding on, sometimes holding on too tightly, clinging to security, being risk averse, sometimes to the point of stagnation. The Eight of Wands suggests momentum or blocked momentum in this case. In this case, it meant delays, things not moving forward the way you want them to. And next to that, the Star is about hope, healing, renewal, but it's also about patience, about trusting a longer timeline. Here's what's interesting. None of these cards say quit your job or stay at your job. They're not answering the question the way it was asked. Instead, they're pointing to a pattern the querent hadn't articulated, the tension between their desire for security, Four of Pentacles, and their frustration with stagnation, the Eight of Wands, whether it's moving or not, and the possibility that what they actually need isn't a dramatic exit, but a recalibration of expectations and timeline, the Star. As we talked through the cards, the querent started recognizing this pattern in other areas of their life. The way they stayed in relationships longer than they should because leaving felt too risky. The way they'd been talking about writing a novel for 5 years but never started because they couldn't guarantee it would be good. The way they were waiting for perfect clarity before making any move at all. The cards weren't predicting anything. They were reflecting a cognitive pattern, a habitual way of thinking and deciding that was operating across multiple domains. This is what I mean by pattern recognition across different domains. The cards create a structure that lets you see the same pattern showing up in your career, your relationships, your creative life, your relationship with yourself. Without the cards, you might notice you're unhappy at work. You might separately notice you're stuck in your writing. You might have a vague sense that you're playing it too safe. But you probably wouldn't see these as expressions of the same underlying pattern. The cards make the pattern visible by giving you a framework to map it onto. And once you see the pattern, you can work with it. You can ask, is this pattern serving me? Where did I learn it? What would it look like to do something different? These are questions you couldn't ask when you were still inside the pattern, when it was just the way things are. The second major cognitive function tarot trains is narrative construction, specifically the ability to generate multiple narratives from the same set of facts. We are story-making creatures. We can't help it. Your brain is constantly constructing narratives to explain what is happening and why. The problem is, we usually construct one narrative and then treat it as the truth. This is the story of what's happening. This is why they did that. This is what it means. But any set of facts can support multiple narratives. The same evidence can be organized into different stories depending on what you emphasize, what background you look at, what causal relationships you draw. And the story you tell determines what actions seem possible, what emotions seem appropriate, what future seems likely. Tarot is a structured practice for generating alternative narratives. When you lay out cards, you're not discovering the one true story. You're exploring what stories could be told, what patterns could be emphasized, what meanings could be made. And this is a skill, the ability to hold multiple interpretations simultaneously, to try on different narratives and see how they fit, to recognize that your first story isn't necessarily the most accurate or useful one. Let's look at another example. Someone draws 3 cards about a friendship that's been feeling strained: the Five of Cups, the Two of Swords, and the Knight of Wands. The Five of Cups is often about loss, grief, focusing on what's going wrong while missing what's still available. The Two of Swords is about difficult choices or stalemate, sometimes willful blindness or refusal to see. The Knight of Wands tends to be about impulsive action, enthusiasm, sometimes recklessness or lack of follow through. Here's one narrative. You're stuck in grief about how the friendship used to be, the Five of Cups, unable to make a decision about whether to address the problem or let it go, Two of Swords, and your friend's impulsive, unreliable behavior, Knight of Wands, is part of what's causing the strain. But here's another narrative. You're focusing on what's wrong in the friendship and missing what's still good, the Five of Cups. You're avoiding a necessary conversation because you're afraid of conflict, the Two of Swords. And what you're interpreting as your friend's recklessness, the Knight of Wands, might actually be their way of trying to inject energy and excitement into a friendship that's become too heavy. Or another narrative. Both of you are grieving the easy intimacy you used to have, the Five of Cups. Both of you are stuck in a pattern of not addressing things directly, the Two of Swords. And the friendship needs someone to take bold, possibly uncomfortable action to break the stalemate, the Knight of Wands. And that someone might need to be you. Same cards, 3 different stories. And notice what happens as you try on each narrative. Different emotions arise, different actions seem called for, different futures seem possible. In the first story, you're a victim of your friend's behavior. In the second, you're misinterpreting their actions through a lens of negativity. In the third, you're both stuck and both responsible for getting unstuck. This is not relativism. It's not saying all interpretations are equally valid or that truth doesn't matter. It's saying that the story you're currently telling yourself is one possible organization of the facts, and it's worth checking whether it's the most accurate or useful one. Tarot gives you a structured way to do that checking. And here's what's crucial. This skill transfers. Once you've practiced generating multiple narratives with cards, you start doing it automatically in your regular life. Someone cancels plans at the last minute, and instead of immediately jumping to, they don't value my time, you pause. You consider other stories. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they're bad at planning. Maybe they do value your time, but something urgent came up. You don't know which story is true yet, but you're no longer trapped in the first story your brain generated. This is what critical thinking actually looks like in practice. Not some abstract logical procedure, but the concrete ability to step back from your initial interpretation and ask, what else could this mean? The third cognitive function, and this one is subtle but profound, is perspective taking. Tarot trains you to inhabit viewpoints that aren't naturally yours. Every card in the tarot is, in some sense, a perspective. The Hermit sees the world differently than the Empress. The Five of Pentacles has a different vantage point than the Ten of Cups. When you read cards, you're practicing stepping into these perspectives, seeing your situation through their eyes, understanding what becomes visible from that angle and what becomes invisible. This is different from empathy in the usual sense. Empathy is about feeling what someone else feels. Perspective taking is more cognitive. It's about understanding how someone else thinks, what they prioritize, what logic they're operating from. And it's a learnable skill. You get better at it with practice. Here's why this matters. Most of the time, you're trapped in your own perspective without realizing it. You think you're seeing the situation objectively, but you're actually seeing it from your particular vantage point with your particular values and priorities and fears. And from inside that perspective, certain things seem obviously true. Certain actions seem obviously right. Certain outcomes seem obviously desirable. Tarot gives you a systematic way to step outside your default perspective. When the Emperor shows up in a reading, you have to consider, what would this situation look like if structure and authority and control were the highest values? When the Moon appears, you have to ask, what would this situation look like if you took seriously the irrational, the unconscious, the things you can't quite articulate? When you get the Six of Pentacles, you have to think about power dynamics, about giving and receiving, about generosity and debt. Let me give you an example that really drove this home for me. I was doing a reading for myself about a conflict with a collaborator. I felt like I was being reasonable and they were being difficult. P.S. This is not about Amelia. I was frustrated. I wanted validation, honesty. I wanted the cards to confirm that I was right and they were wrong. I drew the Five of Swords. If you know this card, you know it's uncomfortable. It's often about winning at any cost, about Pyrrhic victory, about conflict where someone has to lose. It's not a card that makes you feel good about yourself. My first reaction was defensiveness. No, I'm not being like that. I'm not trying to win. I'm just trying to get them to see reason. But the card was sitting there, and I'd committed to actually working with whatever came up, so I had to sit with it. I had to try on the perspective of the Five of Swords. And from that perspective, some uncomfortable things became visible. Yes, I was trying to be reasonable, but I was also attached to being right. I was more interested in proving my point than in finding a solution that worked for both of us. I was keeping score of who had compromised more. I was, in fact, approaching the conflict as something to win. This wasn't comfortable to see, but it was useful because once I could see my own behavior from that perspective, I could choose to do something different. I could decide that being right was less important than maintaining the collaboration. I could stop keeping score. I could approach the next conversation directly. The Five of Swords didn't tell me I was a bad person. It gave me a perspective I couldn't access from inside my own defensive, self-justifying mindset. It showed me what I looked like from the outside, and that's incredibly valuable information. This is what perspective taking does. It breaks you out of the prison of your own viewpoint. It shows you that your way of seeing isn't the only way of seeing, and sometimes it's not even the most accurate way. And the more you practice this with the cards, the more you start doing it in real time. You're in an argument, and some part of your brain automatically asks, what does this look like from their perspective? What am I not seeing because of where I'm standing? This is the foundation of wisdom, by the way. Not knowledge, wisdom. The ability to see from multiple angles, to understand that your truth is partial, to hold your own perspective lightly enough that you can consider others. The fourth cognitive function is perhaps the most important and the least discussed. Tarot trains you to sit with ambiguity without collapsing it prematurely into certainty. We are deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. Our brains want clear answers, definite categories, unambiguous meanings. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If you're not sure whether that's a snake or a stick, better to assume snake and be wrong than assume stick and be dead. But in complex human situations, this drive for premature certainty is often counterproductive. Real situations are ambiguous. People's motivations are mixed. Outcomes are uncertain. The right course of action isn't obvious. And yet we constantly collapse this ambiguity. We decide what something means before we've really looked at it. We choose an interpretation and then defend it. We want to know what's going to happen, what we should do, whether it's going to work out. We want certainty. Tarot doesn't give you certainty. It gives you more ambiguity. A card like the Hanged Man doesn't mean one thing. It means suspension, waiting, seeing from a new angle, sacrifice, surrender, being stuck, choosing to pause, being forced to pause, wisdom through inaction. Which meaning is relevant depends on context, on the other cards, on what's actually happening in your life. You have to sit with the ambiguity. You have to tolerate not knowing exactly what it means right away. And this is a practice. The more you work with tarot, the more comfortable you become with this state of not quite knowing. You learn to stay in the question longer. You learn to notice when you're rushing to interpretation because you're uncomfortable with uncertainty. You learn that the most useful insights often come not from the first obvious meaning, but from sitting with the cards long enough that something deeper emerges. I think this might be the most valuable thing tarot teaches, honestly, because life is ambiguous. People are ambiguous. You are ambiguous. Your own motivations are often mixed. Your feelings are often contradictory. Your desires are often in conflict with each other. And if you can't tolerate that ambiguity, if you always need to collapse it into a simple story, you're going to miss most of what's actually happening. Let me give you a final example. Someone comes in asking about whether to move to a new city for a relationship. Big question and high stakes. They want a yes or no. They want to know if it's going to work out. The cards are the Lovers, the Tower, and Temperance. Now, the Lovers is obviously relevant to a question about a relationship, but it's not just about romance. It's about choice, about values, about what you're committing to. The Tower is about upheaval, destruction of old structures, sometimes necessary chaos. And Temperance is about balance, integration, patience, the slow work of combining different elements into something new. So what's the answer? Should they move? The cards don't say. What they say is this. This is a significant choice that will require you to examine your values, the Lovers. It will involve upheaval and the destruction of your current life structure, the Tower. And it will require patience and the ability to integrate very different elements, probably your old life and your new life, your identity as an individual and your identity in this relationship, Temperance. That's not a yes or no. That's a map of the territory. It's saying, if you do this, here's what you're signing up for. Here's what it's going to require of you. Here's what you need to be prepared for. And the querent has to sit with that. They have to tolerate not getting the clear answer they wanted. They have to think about whether they're ready for upheaval. They have to consider whether they have the patience and skill for the integration work. They have to decide whether this relationship is worth what it's going to cost. This is so much more useful than a yes or no. A yes or no would let them off the hook. It would let them avoid responsibility for the choice. But the ambiguous answer, the answer that maps the territory without telling them what to do, that requires them to actually think, to weigh, to choose consciously rather than looking for permission or prohibition from an external authority. And this is what sitting with ambiguity trains you to do, to make decisions without false certainty, to act without knowing for sure how it's going to turn out, to take responsibility for your choices instead of outsourcing them to fate or fortune or the universe. Now let's talk about what all of this has in common. Because pattern recognition, narrative construction, perspective taking, and sitting with ambiguity aren't just random skills. They're all aspects of this same fundamental capacity, interpretive thinking. Interpretation is what you do when you're faced with something that doesn't have a single obvious meaning. A poem, a dream, a person's behavior, a complex situation. You can't just apply a formula or look up the answer. You have to engage with it, bring your intelligence and experience to bear, make meaning through the act of interpretation itself. And here's what's crucial. Interpretation is a skill. You can get better at it. You can learn to do it more carefully, more creatively, more rigorously. This is what literary criticism does. This is what psychoanalysis teaches. This is what good journalism teaches. And this is what tarot teaches. When you read tarot, you're practicing interpretation. You're learning to look closely at symbols and see what they might mean in context. You're learning to hold multiple meanings simultaneously. You're learning to support your interpretations with evidence while remaining open to revision. You're learning to distinguish between a reading that's genuinely insightful and one that's just projection or wishful thinking. These are the same skills you use when you're trying to understand a difficult text or figure out what's really going on in a conversation or make sense of your own emotional reactions. They're the skills of critical thinking, but not critical thinking in the abstract. Critical thinking applied to the messy, ambiguous, symbol-laden reality of human experience. And this is why tarot doesn't require belief. You don't have to believe in literary criticism for it to help you understand a novel better. You don't have to believe in psychoanalysis for it to give you insights into your own patterns. You just have to engage with the practice, use the tools, see what they reveal. Same with tarot. The cards are a text. Your life is a text. The reading is the act of bringing these two texts into conversation and seeing what meanings emerge. That's not magic, that's hermeneutics. That's the ancient and entirely secular practice of interpretation. I want to address something directly because I know some of you are thinking it. Isn't this just confirmation bias? Aren't you just seeing what you want to see in the cards? Yes and no. Yes, confirmation bias is always a risk. Your brain is always trying to make the cards fit your existing narrative. But here's the thing. Tarot done well actually works against confirmation bias rather than enabling it. Remember what I said about pattern recognition? The cards are random. You didn't choose them. So they're constantly introducing elements that don't fit your existing story. The Tower shows up when you wanted the Sun. The Five of Pentacles appears when you were expecting the Ace of Wands. And you have to deal with that. You have to make sense of cards that don't confirm what you already thought. That is very different from, say, reading your horoscope where the language is vague enough that you can make it mean whatever you want. Tarot cards are specific. They have particular imagery, particular traditional meanings, particular relationships to each other. You can't just make them mean anything. Well, you can, but if you're doing that, you're not really reading tarot. You're just using cards as a Rorschach test. Good tarot reading involves a constant negotiation between the cards and your situation. You're not just projecting onto the cards, and you're not just passively receiving their message. You're in dialogue with them. They suggest something, you consider how it applies, you adjust your understanding, you look at the cards again with that new understanding, they reveal something else. It's iterative, it's dialectical. And this is actually how all good interpretation works. When you're reading a poem, you're not just imposing your meaning onto it, and you're not just extracting some pre-existing meaning from it. You're in conversation with it. The poem says something, you respond, your response changes how you read the next line, which changes your understanding of what came before. Meaning emerges from this process. So yes, you can do tarot badly. You can use it to confirm what you already think. You can cherry pick meanings that support your preferred narrative, but you can also do it well. You can use it to challenge your assumptions, to see what you're missing, to consider perspectives you wouldn't naturally take. And the difference between doing it badly and doing it well is the same as the difference between bad interpretation and good interpretation in any domain. Rigor, honesty, willingness to be surprised, willingness to be wrong. Here's what I think is really going on with the tarot. The thing that makes it more than just a party trick or a self-help gimmick. It's a technology for making the implicit explicit. You already know most of what the cards tell you. Not consciously maybe, but somewhere in your system you know. You know that you're avoiding a difficult conversation. You know that you're repeating a pattern from your past. You know that you're more afraid than you're admitting. You know that you're not being honest with yourself about what you want. But knowing something implicitly and knowing it explicitly are very different. Implicit knowledge doesn't give you much leverage. It's just a vague sense, a feeling, an intuition you can't quite articulate. Explicit knowledge, knowledge you can name, examine, work with, that's powerful. That's actionable. Tarot is a tool for converting implicit knowledge into explicit knowledge. The cards give you a structure to hang your intuitions on, a vocabulary to articulate what you're sensing, a framework to organize what you already know but haven't quite admitted to yourself. This is why readings often feel like recognition rather than revelation. It's not that cards are telling you something completely new. It's that they're helping you see clearly something you already knew dimly. They're bringing into focus what was blurry. They're giving you language for what was wordless. And once something is explicit, you can work with it. You can examine it. You can question it. You can decide whether it's true. You can choose to do something different. Implicit knowledge just runs you. Explicit knowledge gives you choice. This is the real magic of tarot, if we're going to use that word. Not supernatural magic, but the magic of consciousness itself. The way that bringing something into awareness changes your relationship to it, gives you power over it, makes transformation possible. So what replaces belief? Practice replaces belief. Skill replaces belief. The actual, demonstrable, repeatable experience of using tarot as a tool for thinking replaces the question of whether you believe in it. You don't believe in a hammer, you use a hammer. You get better at using a hammer. You learn when a hammer is the right tool and when you need something else. You appreciate a well-made hammer. You might even develop a relationship with a particular hammer that served you well over the years. Same with tarot. You don't have to believe in it. You just have to use it. Pay attention to what it does. Notice what becomes visible when you lay out cards that weren't visible before. Track whether the insights you get are actually useful. Refine your practice. Get better at interpretation. And here's what I found. The less you worry about belief, the more useful tarot becomes. Because you're not trying to defend it or justify it or prove anything about it. You're just using it. You're treating it as what it is for this purpose. A tool for thinking, a practice for interpretation, a technology for making meaning. This is what I mean when I say I take tarot seriously. I take seriously the cognitive work it does. I take seriously the skills it trains. I take seriously the insights it generates. I take seriously the practice of interpretation itself. Because, and maybe I'm just saying this because I'm a university professor, but interpretation matters. The ability to read situations, to understand symbols, to generate multiple narratives, to take different perspectives, to sit with ambiguity, these abilities truly matter. They make you more thoughtful, more flexible, more aware, better able to navigate complexity, better able to understand yourself and others. And in a world that's increasingly complex, increasingly ambiguous, increasingly resistant to simple answers, these are the skills we need, not certainty, not belief, but the ability to think carefully about things that don't have obvious answers, the ability to make meaning in the face of uncertainty, the ability to interpret. Tarot teaches that because it's a practice, a discipline, a craft, and like any craft, you get out of it what you put into it. You get better with practice. You develop judgment. You learn to trust your interpretive abilities while remaining humble about their limits. So here's where I want to leave you. Tarot is not about believing or not believing. It's about practicing. It's about developing capacities that are useful regardless of your metaphysical commitments. It's about getting better at the fundamental human activity of making meaning. This approach may feel different from other ways of working with tarot. It doesn't offer certainty and it doesn't promise definitive answers, but it gives you something valuable. It gives you agency. It gives you tools. It gives you practice and the skills that actually help you navigate your life. You don't need to believe in tarot for it to be useful. You just need to be willing to engage with it seriously, to practice interpretation, and to develop your skills. The cards will do their work whether you believe in them or not. The cognitive work they do is real and observable. It's the work of making visible what was invisible, explicit what was implicit, conscious what was unconscious. And that work, the work of interpretation, of meaning making, of thinking carefully about complex things, that's some of the most important work we do as humans. Tarot is just one way to practice it. A particularly rich, particularly beautiful, particularly effective way, but a way nonetheless. So don't worry about belief, worry about practice. Worry about getting better at interpretation. Worry about developing the skills that let you see clearly, think flexibly, and make meaning in the face of ambiguity. The cards are waiting, maybe not to tell you the future, definitely not to give you clear answers, but to help you think, to help you see, to help you practice the art of interpretation. And that, I think, is more than enough. If this line of thinking sparked something for you, I'd invite you to take it a step further on your own terms. Do some careful reading. Seek out writers who take tarot seriously without being credulous about it. And if you work with the cards yourself, approach them experimentally, slowly, critically, and with genuine attention to context rather than outcome. I'm not here to convert anyone or to insist on a particular explanation for why tarot works. My argument is simply this: practices that have endured for centuries, that continue to support reflection, insight, and meaning making across cultures and contexts, deserve more thoughtful engagement than they often receive. They deserve to be taken seriously. Whether or not you believe tarot is magical, it is demonstrably a sophisticated symbolic system, one that trains attention, sharpens interpretation, and invites deeper contact with your own experience. In a world that often discourages reflection, that alone is worth taking seriously. If you have thoughts about this, or questions, or even disagreements, I genuinely love to hear them. The comments are open, and this channel exists for real conversation, not consensus. Tell me what landed for you. Tell me what didn't. Tell me what you're curious about next. Thanks for spending your time here with me. If this was valuable, please like, subscribe, share it with someone who you know thinks about these things and is interested in the way that tarot works. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the lab.